So I think if I can hand you over to you, Afzal.
We failed to coordinate anything. I had no idea that I was going to be speaking next, which allows lots of options for creativity.
You can go second. I can go now if you like.
It's too late. Let's do this. And actually, you'll be able to salvage a lot of the report that I would have failed to do today. So anyway, let's. Because we failed to coordinate everything, I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that Mike just explained in a little more detail. Do I have a clicker or?
Keep on here.
Oh, okay, it's manual. Okay, so this is what we started off with. The idea of what we thought we were supposed to do, which was, convert this second prize into something meaningful. We looked at the 4 areas that Mike talked about. Structural failure was the word we used, but we've had to narrow things down. So we've got this big concept of failure that people have talked about. What does it mean in some detail? In the hope that having looked at the detail, we can go back up, modify that concept. So we've looked at individual outputs. We thought would be conferences, papers. Main thing is this thing. I thought that would be an output. Actually, this is really a trigger for further work. And we were going to come out with a few specific deliverables, if you like. But looking at what it could mean, the assumption for our area, the sort of policy conflict area, was going to be that leadership might be one of the areas to look at. Policy might be an area to look at. We looked at the hypothesis that politics and business equates policy failure with failure of power leadership, and so it has negative consequences. What might very, I think, rightly did was look at, talk about failure in the positive sense, and I think that's really important. But maybe we shouldn't look at conflict, wars, as a positive. We failed in this war. It's not positive because a price has been paid by precious lives. So maybe the very fact that there is a chance of failure could be used in a positive sense in that we avoid certainly wars that lead to worse situations. The theme, we would look at environmental, political and economic aspects, trying to narrow it down whilst not making it too narrow. Sub-themes, we're looking at security, diplomacy and peace support in our area, and these are all open to negotiations. And then the challenges we had was cross-disciplinary work. And that's something I think, personally, I feel that we haven't really succeeded in as much as I would have liked. We've fragmented around our comfort zones, our 4 themes, and hopefully we can rectify that by bringing things together. And it's the first issue for me as well, because I'm not, my first degree was in aeronautical engineering. I'm still an engineer, and I'm a failed sportsman. I represented Scotland at the international level without actually being Scottish, and I represented Great Britain at international level without being good. So, so there we go. This was a sort of design that we talked about. We're here. What I hope we'll be able to do, and that's open to everybody, was published a literature review, which I commissioned and looked at. I'll just briefly go through that in a minute. Just published that as a basic output. I don't think it's going to hit any ref marks, but it's something that we can share with people. Published a joint paper with our visiting fellow. So you write it, and we just and then joint paper between the team of 4 of us, written together. We hopefully learned from our various aspects. So our international fellow, Professor Angelo Echeverra, is here. He's from the US Army War College. He's editor of US Army War College Quarterly Parameters. And in the last 24 hours, he's already recruited 3 people to write papers with him. So that's why he's so successful. I took him for dinner with a couple of people last night. People agree he's already asked me to write something. So he's authored books on conflict-related topics, specifically addressing the issue of failure. So I think most of our research is already done. Graduate of the US Army Military Academy at West Point, distinguished military career. So he knows the world of conflict, both from the physical, the actual real world, as well as the academic world. He's held a NATO Fulbright, as well as been to Oxford on a number of occasions. And I'm very glad that he's upgraded his visiting fellowship by coming to Loughborough. What do we know through our literature review on failure? So understanding failure, defining what failure is, we talked about it a little bit, noting the ambiguity, the shift from visiting, from the view of failure as a positive, opposite of success, to considering it's a significant factor in understanding the transformational processes. This is what's coming out of the literature review. And the literature review argues that failure, including minor ones, during processes, need more transparent documentation to avoid overly simplistic views of processes from linear progression. Now, that is a very complex academic thing, which really very clearly was articulated by Mike when he talked about aviation failure. And the idea that Matthew Say talks about black box, I think that's fundamentally wrong. The black box is just a means for recording failure. It's the attitude, the cultural attitude, putting flight safety first, human factors first. That's what's elevated what was one of the highest risk modes of transport to one of the lowest risk modes of transport. It's that cultural attitude. And so that is the academic speak for transparency, being open about failure. And then we've got policy failures. We start with examining the concept. What is policy? Policy is the political tools meant to achieve specific aims, but often fail due to various factors. Malicious design, hidden agendas, complexity of defining policies, deeper understanding of policies intended and actual. This is really big here in the political world. You, or we rather, as citizens, we're told what the intended purpose of the conflict is. The actual purpose of a conflict, a war where people lose their lives, is different. So that's one of the reasons why it failed. And there's a lot of complexity and interesting bits there. Let me give you an example. People don't like. I do tell lots of stories, but they're true. Let me give you this example. It's private. I was in the room when Lord Reed decided that we should go to war in Afghanistan. And he said, speaking to his military commanders, joint chiefs of command, joint chiefs of the military. Gentlemen, the time has now come for us to stop our work in Iraq and go to Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is a war on drugs and it's a war we can win. You see these silence in the room? And the only voice I heard was in my head, saying, Minister, if you think Afghanistan is a war that you can win, then either you or I are in. Yes. The point is this, that intended and actual, very different. What was the actual? The actual was, gentlemen, we have failed in Iraq. He didn't use the word failure, but he had failed. I don't think it's fair to bore you to death with the points. Okay, so this is just one of the many, many things behind this. This is a really important subject, and it's a subject probably more so than aviation, where people's lives, their happiness, their quality of life through going through conflict is at stake. Well, I had a friend who was in the military with me, one of the toughest men in parachute regiment. He's now doing a PhD here under our supervision on PTSD, on the leadership association with PTSD. because he suffered from PTSD during the Afghan war. And it can happen, the tougher you are, the more likely you are in many ways to suffer from this stuff. So there's a lot of stuff in here. What the literature review continues to tell us is the relationship between conflict and failure, both is independent of the concept and in relation to the idea of failure as well. So we've got two different avenues of thought. Failure can lead to conflict, it can occur during conflict and follow from the aftermath of conflict as PTSD and many other things come about. Just come back from Rwanda. That's a country that has suffered from PTSD 30 years later. They're recovering both in a positive sense, in a very impressive sense. They use that conflict in a very positive sense, but also many people are still suffering the after effects, emotional and otherwise. Analytical methods, we've looked at various research methods to evaluate failure. There's something called the multi-level perspective. If ever anybody's interested, I can bore you to death on that. And that offers a detailed contextual way of analyzing things. And if you combine MLP with other methods, we can make it more powerful. And if the team wishes, we can explore analytical methods and maybe add to that area of literature. You'll be pleased to know that I've nearly ended. So gaps for future research, long-term impacts of failure, what are they? They're not really explored in the current literature. Emotional impacts of failure on policymakers. When they fail, do they emotionally ever sense it? Certainly my knowledge of people like Tony Blair, who's responsible for the greatest failure of conflict in the UK in modern history, he's very happy. He's making a lot of money. Real objectives behind policies perceived or failed, what are they? That's an area that is not researched because of the reasons I've explained. People don't talk about the real and the presentational because we are covering one by the other. But it is one that needs to be looked at, particularly in democratic societies. How can we be responsible for our governance if we don't know what the truth is? And it's for democratic societies to say it's a representative government and you represent us, not the other way around. So the ideas should flow from us to you. I'm just suggesting that. Characteristics of conflicts that affect success of peacekeeping efforts. This is an area that, again, is not explored well enough. There's a lot of problems with peacekeeping. Ideally, we don't need peacekeeping. We won't have. We might avoid the outbreak of anti-peace efforts or instability or conflict. But when we do have peacekeeping, they tend to fail. Incidentally, I'm sure you're pleased to chip in. I don't think the West has won a significant war in the last 30 years, certainly not since Vietnam. There's an exception with glorious conflict the UK was involved in the Falkland Islands, and small exceptions with Kosovo and with Sierra Leone. But all the major conflicts have resulted in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, souls of deaths, millions of people killed, usually from the third world, from developing world. Tens of millions, if not more, displaced and long-term losses. And we accept that we are doing well. We need to invest more in what we're doing in terms of armed forces. But if we are ready to buy more tanks, more ships, more people under arms, and continue the failure on a larger scale, we revisit this and make the world a better place. That's the questions that come out of the literature review, which I hope all of our four strands study. I think I've run out of this. It's certainly run out of time. Thank you.